Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'll be covering my top 10 board games with fantasy themes. Yes, fantasy themed board games for today. That's what's on the menu. And when it comes to fantasy, I go for very generic fantasy. I'm talking about games that include dwarves and elves and orcs and goblins and halflings. That is basically what I'm looking for. Now, as I prepared this list, I realized there's lots of fantasy themed board games that are not going to make it to this list that I love and adore and that you've seen in many other lists. And the reasons why they're not going to make it is because as I organized this list and ranked it, I went by how much of an immersive story-like experience do these games give me. And there's some great games, some great fantasy themed games like Magic the Gathering, for instance, that's not going to make it on this list because for as much as I love this game, I love it for its tactical approach, for its mechanisms, but at the end of the day, I don't really feel too much of a story when I play Magic the Gathering. That's just me personally. Another game that won't make it, a notable game, would be Battle Lore. And for those who watch this channel, you would know that I love the Command and Color system of games. And this falls within this line of games. And this game would rank very highly on this list if it were for the fact that this doesn't really give me too much of a storyline feel. Again, I just really enjoy the CNC mechanisms and gameplay, and that is why I like this. So without any further ado, let's talk about the games that really did make it to the list. My number 10 fantasy themed board game is Summoner Wars, and right here I have the Alliances Master Set. And this game is like Magic the Gathering, except with some spatial factors, because you are playing cards and you're a summoner and you're casting spells and you're summoning different creatures within your particular race. But the difference is they actually move, and you roll some dice to, resolve conflict, and you roll a certain amount, you trigger hits, and a certain amounts are misses. But it's really cool because each faction plays very differently, has different types of summoners with different, healths and attack powers, different special abilities, and so on and so forth. And even the cards that you kill from your opponent eventually become a currency of sorts known as your magic, which you use to summon other creatures from your deck. Really cool. I just love the mechanisms of this game. However, from a storyline perspective, it is a little bit weak, it is a little bit light, and this is why it makes it to number 10, because I love this game, mechanically speaking. But it does give me more of a storyline feel than Magic the Gathering, because at least I feel like I'm maneuvering these pieces, I'm maneuvering these different cards that represent your units, and that feels a little bit like a story. Also, the different characters and their text and their flavor text add a little bit to that storyline feel, right? You feel like these are characters that have backstories and have some sort of history with each other and with others, right? So again, that's why it makes it as low as number 10, but just does make it. I love this game. My number 10 fantasy themed board game of all time, Summoner Wars. And now we move on to my number 9, and it is Clank, the adventure deck building game, or a deck building adventure. This is a deck building game with a fantasy theme, but it has a spatial element to it, which again is where the storyline immersive experience comes from. It comes from physically manipulating that dungeon as you're building your deck, yes, and trying to have enough attack to fight monsters, enough money to buy certain items, but also enough boots to be able to move and maneuver through that dungeon quickly enough and efficiently enough to race your opponents to the goods, to the high valuable treasures, but also race back out of that dungeon before that dragon awakens and catches you and kills you, right? Really cool, really fun. I love deck building. I love deck builders that have multiple currencies. Again, this ranks as low as number 9 because really what gives it that storyline feel is that it's not just a card-based deck builder, but you also have that board that you are maneuvering. My number 9 fantasy themed board game of all time, Clank, the original. Then my number 8 fantasy themed board game of all time is Lord of the Rings, the original co-op game designed by Reiner Knizia, which, by the way, there's going to be a 20th anniversary edition coming out soon. So that's really neat. That's really cool. Now, this game, lots of people, just like your typical Reiner Knizia games. The mechanisms don't necessarily integrate that well with the theme, but what adds to the storyline experience, the immersive experience in this game, is the cadence of the game. The flow and the progression of the game really makes you feel the tension and the emotion that watching the movies or reading the books would evoke when you think about the story, when you think about the quest, when you think about the goal to Mordor and to Mount Doom to destroy the One Ring, when you think about the cast of characters, in particular zeroing in on the hobbits. All the player characters here in this game are hobbits, and all the other characters in the Lord of the Rings universe, you know, all the way from Aragorn to Gandalf, and how they interact with the story. Again, you're just playing some cards with different symbols on it, but all the different adventure player boards that you're advancing on, and how Sauron interacts with the players, and how, you know, the threat of evil interacts with the players, and how even the One Ring can be both good and bad at the same time. There's so many things that add to the tension and to the emotional experience that is this game. First of all, I must admit, I'm a big fan of the Lord of the Rings intellectual property, so that plays a big factor in it too, right? The fact that I can immerse myself in that universe because there's an affinity, there's a resonance with this product, with this lore, with this universe. But again, if you are moderately a fan of Lord of the Rings, I think you can enjoy this game. It's a very sound game mechanically, but again, Reiner Knizia found a way to immerse you in the quest of destroying that One Ring. My number 7 fantasy themed board game of all time, Lord of the Rings. So we got 10, 9, 8. I'm sorry, that's my number 8. Now we move on to my number 7 fantasy themed board game of all time, and that is Shadowscape. And this is a card-based dungeon crawler that is in the Mistfall universe. I have not actually played Mistfall as of yet. Now you set up your dungeon, which consists of a 5x5 grid of different cards from this game that you shuffle up. There's a bunch of different player characters, heroes that you could control, a bunch of different overlords that you could choose to fight against, and then you got your standard group of monsters, and there's 3 different types of monsters, and they all fight differently and move differently and so on and so forth. Now, there are aspects of this game that I am a little bit critical on. It doesn't feel... I wish there was a way for solo and co-op play, because you could play this competitively, and you could also play it solo and co-op, which is the way I would prefer to play my fantasy-themed, immersive, story-driven games. And I feel that the co-op and the solo mode don't really have varying ranges of difficulty. That would be cool. But I do like the mechanisms in this game. You know, you have a bunch of, you know, skill cards that you're using throughout the game, and they're double-sided, and the opposite side of each card has a different action that you could take. And every time you use an action, you flip it to the other side of the card, and that action is no longer available until you use the other side of the card in order to flip it up and make the previous action available. So how you manage those 4 action cards that you have is really cool. I love the fact that there are ways of upgrading. You're defeating monsters, you know, gaining treasures, and you're using all that to, you know, buy more equipment, to, get additional skills or action cards that make your character more and more powerful, to get the different whisper cards, which get you runes, but also, you know, trigger the end of the game, because until you trigger those or reveal the card that says that the Overlord is placed in the center of the board, you can't even fight the Overlord, and that's how you theoretically win the game in a co-op or a solo mode. There's some really cool things here mechanically. There is a lot of variety in this box. There's an expansion for this game as well, but there's a good amount of heroes and a good amount of Overlords to mix and match with as the game continues. You also have the fate cards here, and the fate cards are really interesting because you could use them as boost to your different skills. So you could boost your skill temporarily, or the action that you take in that current turn, or you can use them for a special action that is written on the fate card. So managing that and balancing what you're going to use those different fate cards for is very unique and very interesting. So that's it. This is my number 7 fantasy themed board game of all time, Shadowscape. And now we move on to my number 6, and it's another small card-based dungeon crawl, and it's One Deck Dungeon. And this game is so neat. It's so transportable. Shadowscape is pretty small, not too much bigger, but this one is definitely less table space, which is even neater. Shadowscape does take that 5x5 grid, and all the decks of cards do take up a lot of space. This, you can play on a small table. You might even be able to play this at the back of a tray on an airplane even, I think. Don't quote me. But again, this game is fun. You could play it solo. You could play it cooperatively with up to 2 people. I think you could play with 4 people if you buy a second set. It's really cool because you got these dungeons that you're exploring, and on the opposite side, there's 2 types of cards. There's either perils or there's creatures that you're going to combat against or fight with. And the way you do it is you're rolling these dice, different colored dice based on your skills of your characters, and you're trying to roll certain numbers to cover certain spots on these different encounters, whether it be the perils or the different creatures you're combating. And you got to cover the spaces, and whatever spaces you cannot cover up with your dice that you roll, you're going to suffer the consequences. And there's 2 types of consequences. Either damage will be dealt to you, which eventually can kill and eliminate your player from the game, or you will suffer the loss of time. And the loss of time is represented by the discarding of cards from the main deck. And time is a factor. It's something you want to balance, right? Because you only have a certain amount of time before you must be leveled up high enough to be able to compete with the Overlord. And it's really cool because there is a great leveling up system where you use all the different encounter cards that you accomplish, that you defeat, whether they're perils or creatures. You use them as either experience points to level up your characters, or you use them as equipment to add to the skills and therefore the dice that your characters roll. You use them as special abilities, one time a round or one time a turn abilities that your players can tap into, or you use them as special potions that, again, your players can use as long as they have some potion cubes to turn in. And deciding as you defeat or accomplish a certain encounter, deciding what you're going to use that card for, because every card has one of those 4 purposes, so therefore it is technically a multi-purpose card game. Deciding that is so key and so crucial, and again, a big factor in the game. So much fun. I do feel like it's a storyline, just like Shadowscape. There's a lot of content in this game, a good amount of heroes that you could choose from, a good amount of different masterminds or overlords with their respective dungeons you could choose from in this game. And again, this game has a little bit of expansion content out there as well. My number 6 fantasy themed board game of all time, One Deck Dungeon. And now we move on to my top 5, the cream of the crop, the bread and butter. And my number 5 is a Game of Thrones, the card game. And this is a game I've been playing recently, and I've been enjoying it a lot. Eric Lang, who I love and enjoy his games. Nate French, who the only other game I've played of his, I also love and enjoy. This game is amazing. It really does, in my opinion at least, I've just recently been exposed to the intellectual property. In my opinion, it does convey this theme and this story and this lore in a way that does it justice, in a way that does it honor, right? The different characters kind of feel like you would think they should feel like, right? And basically every player has a deck which consists of one of the houses of Westeros. You choose which house you want to represent, and they go at it. And each round you're choosing these different plot cards, and the plot cards basically make every round feel absolutely different from the other. So not only do games feel different from one another, even the rounds feel different from one another, because the plot cards determine how much money a player has available in order to purchase their cards. It determines some special rules, some certain advantages, who goes first in the turn order, all these things. And even though this game plays great, or plays up to 4 players, I've only played it with 2 players, and I think that's how I'm going to prefer it, because I do like that 2-player tactical approach to card games such as this. It's really neat because you're combating and competing in 3 different spheres. You're competing in intrigue, you're competing in power, and you're competing in war, right? Or military. And every character is helpful in at least one of those 3 spheres. The really good characters, the really valuable characters, might be helpful in up to 2 of those spheres, but no character is useful in all 3 of those. So as you are the attacker or the aggressor, you rotate or tap your cards in order to indicate that you're attacking. Your opponent taps or rotates the cards that they're choosing to defend with, and then you figure it out and resolve the conflict and determine the casualties and consequences for the losers and or winners. Really cool, really neat, really basic, but again, at the same time, it captures the intellectual property and the storyline feel and the struggle for Westeros, the struggle for the Iron Throne. I feel like you get some of that experience as you play this very well-designed card game. A Game of Thrones, the card game, my number 5 fantasy-themed board game of all time. And now we move on to my number 4. And speaking of Nate French, Lord of the Rings, the living card game. Also designed by Nate French, solo, all by himself, and published by Fantasy Flight Games. Again, I mentioned earlier earlier with the Reiner Knizia Lord of the Rings games. I'm a big fan of the intellectual property. I like the way this game carries out the story. I might actually like the Reiner Knizia game a little bit better than this game. It's hard. They're very close. I like them both a lot. But this one is definitely better from a storyline perspective. It just feels like you're on a different quest each time, which the game comes with a lot of different quests, and you're progressing and you're encountering all of these characters, and you yourself are managing your deck of characters, of different characters, you know, from the free people of Middle Earth, and you're trying to fight Sauron and all his evil forces, and they come in a plethora of different, you know, shapes and forms and sizes. And you're trying to just manage all these things, and your different characters provide different things for you. They provide power for attack, but they also provide will in order to complete and accomplish certain quests, right? So all the different decks with different characters from different factions or spheres of influence, as they call it, they all play differently. They all, you know, have different advantages, different pros, different cons, different strengths and weaknesses. It plays well. You feel the progression of the story. You feel the tension. When Gandalf, you only have one Gandalf card in your deck. When he comes out, you feel excited, and it represents the idea that Gandalf is available sporadically speaking, right? You can't necessarily always count on his help. But when he does come, you know he's a difference maker. You know that something's about to happen. So when you draw that Gandalf card, something really good is going to happen. And managing all that feels very realistic. It feels very much like in the vein of the theme and the lore of the Lord of the Rings saga. And that's why this is my number 4 fantasy themed board game of all time, Lord of the Rings, a living card game. Now we move on to my number 3, and that's a big box right here. My number 3 fantasy themed board game is Thunderstone Quest. And that's because this is, first of all, my favorite fantasy themed deck building game. And I love deck building games. But this game, this third iteration of this system, really feels like a dungeon crawler. At least to me it does. It legitimately does. You have 2 boards, one representing the dungeon and one representing the village. And on your turn, you got to choose. Am I going to the village to level up, to, you know, go to the market and buy some equipment, some weapons, some spells? Am I going to, you know, go to the temple and heal additionally? Am I going to go to the bazaar and buy myself some food, buy myself some potions, buy myself some lanterns? Right? What am I going to choose to do? Or am I going to go to the dungeon because I feel confident with what I have? I feel confident with my equipment, with my weapons, with my skills, with my items to go there and fight the particular enemies that are in the dungeons. You got a level 0 dungeon, a level 1 dungeon, a level 2 dungeon, a level 3 dungeon, and you're trying to find out where you want to go based on the amount of lanterns, because the deeper you go into the dungeon, the darker it is, and you need those lanterns. And all the time you're acquiring different characters from different races, from different classes. You got elves, you got dwarves, you got humans, you got halflings, but you also got fighters, and you've got clerics, and you've got rogues, and you've got wizards, and you're trying to manage and mix and match that with the corresponding items, weapons, and magic spells that will help said characters. And also, as you're gaining experience points every time you defeat one of these monsters in the different dungeon rooms, you also could use those experience points, which are your points at the end of the game, but you could also use them to level up your characters, right? Because you have a level 0, 1, 2, and 3 versions. Well, actually, your starting cards are level 0, but you have a level 1, 2, and 3 versions of all these different hero cards that you're purchasing through the game, and you want to level them up, because if you get to the level 2 and the level 3 characters, they help you. They give you more money. They give you more attack power. They have more skills to wield more valuable weapons. They have special, you know, bonus actions that they get at the end of an attack or at the beginning of a turn. All these things that you're factoring in as you're leveling up your characters. It truly feels, it captures those RPG dungeon crawler-like characteristics of bigger board games within a deck building, mechanically speaking game. And again, I'm a big fan of deck builders. There's tons of content just in the base game. I'm only carrying the base game here, and it's so heavy, and there's so many cards and so many boards and so many little pieces. This game is wonderful. They even have the little miniatures that you use to move your piece just from the dungeon to the village. You could have easily just made it a meeple, but just to add to that immersive experience, they decided to make it a miniature. My number 3 fantasy themed board game of all time, Thunderstone Quest. And now we move on to my number 2. And I had to compete and think thoroughly about my number 1s and 2. And maybe a couple months ago they would have been switched. But now I am clear, at least for the time being, that my number 2 is Descent: Journeys in the Dark 2nd Edition. This game is fantastic. It's phenomenal. The way I've played it so far has always been one player takes the side of the Overlord, which is usually me, and then a group of players takes the side of the heroes. And we've played campaign style where we're going through different quests, building up on one another, and there's winning conditions for the Overlord, there's winning conditions for the heroes, so it's asymmetric sides. You're doing lots of battling, lots of rolling of dice to resolve conflict, but even the conflict resolution and the customized dice are very unique and very interesting. You're doing some exploration and searching for different items, but between the quests is probably some of the most interesting stuff because players are traveling to the next quest, resolving any potential consequences or benefits that might come as a result of that travel. They're also going to shop and purchasing additional equipments and weapons. They're also leveling up using experience points gained from the previous quest in order to level up their characters and acquire additional, more helpful skills than the ones that they already had. But at the same time, the Overlord is also leveling up and increasing his threat deck, which is basically how he manages his actions and improves upon them and strengthens himself. So both sides are leveling up for the most part evenly in order to keep the game feeling tight from quest to quest. And there are 2 acts, and each act consists of about 4 or 5 quests. So we're talking about 9 quests in total for an entire campaign to be done. This game is fun, it's cool, it's immersive, especially from quest to quest. You really feel like you start to identify and connect with your different characters. Even the Overlord starts to connect with their different monsters, and you feel more invested in the experience. However, I will say that the reason why it's not number 1 is because it does feel like sometimes particular games or particular quests can feel a little bit too much in the favor of the Overlord, and that a few bad breaks and a few unlucky dice rolls can make the game feel a little bit lopsided in certain cases. But you know, again, with randomized games that involve dice rolling, not as much mitigation as you probably would want in a dice rolling game, those things can happen. But for what it is, very fun, immersive game. My number 2 fantasy themed board game of all time, Descent. And now my number 1 fantasy themed board game of all time is Runebound 3rd Edition, designed by Lucas Litzinger and published by Fantasy Flight Games. And how appropriate that a good chunk of my games, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of my top 10 games are from Fantasy Flight. The name is in the title, right? Fantasy Flight. This game is in the same universe as Descent, Battlelore, and some of these other games, the Terranoff universe. It's really cool. I only play this game 2 players, even though you could play up to 4. I do actually occasionally play this game solo as well, but I never play with 3 because it's too much time per player and there would be too much downtime between one player's turn and when they finally go again. But if you want a rich 1 or 2 player fantasy themed experience, this game is it. You travel through the lands of Terranoff, and the way you travel by rolling the different terrain dice is so neat, so cool, so mechanically pleasing. You level up by going to different cities in Terranoff and going to the stores there, going to the shops there, and buying the different equipments that you add to your tokens, which you will flip for conflict resolution. And that's one thing. It's innovative, but perhaps tactically speaking, not as exciting as dice rolling. You're flipping 2-sided tokens, which gives you a 50-50 chance of knowing what you're going to flip on them. And there's some ways of manipulating them and mitigating them in order to reflip them or recast them or turn them to the side of your choice. But the point is, all the other stuff that's going on as you go to shop and acquire more tokens and acquire more equipment, as you train in order to draw new skill cards, and as you go to the different encounters. There's 3 different types of encounters. There's social encounters, exploration encounters, I believe it is, and you have combat encounters. And these different encounters, you succeed them, you get those cards as trophies. You might get some rewards, some money as a reward, but you turn in those trophies in order to acquire these skills that make your character great, because you have 2 acts. I think it's about 12 turns per act, 24 turns, in order to level up your character to the point where he or she can face the final overlord mastermind of the game. And the overlords in this game are tough. They are strong. So if you make a few mistakes, a few bad decisions, or get a few unlucky breaks, you're just not going to have enough to go after that overlord mastermind. And even if you do play a really good, strong, solid game, there's still a good chance that that overlord will beat you. So again, just being as efficient as you can and kind of having a little race to the finish, because you could trigger a battle with the overlord before your opponent does, and if you happen to win, you win the game, right? So you want to be as efficient as possible, maybe not even wait the full 24 turns to go and fight the mastermind. Maybe on turn 22 or turn 23, if you feel like you got a chance, go and fight it, right? And each mastermind comes with their different story, their different plot that affects the game and the map in different ways, that affects the different event cards that come out, the different story cards that come out. Again, very immersive, story-driven game, about an hour and 15 minutes per player, beautiful pieces, beautiful art, mechanically speaking, a fun pleasure of a game to play. My number one fantasy-themed board game of all time, Runebound. And that's it, folks. Those are my top 10 fantasy-themed games of all time. What are your favorite fantasy-themed games? Which ones have I missed? Perhaps I played them, they didn't hit the mark for me. Perhaps I never tried them at all, right? I'm interested and curious to see what you guys have to say. Please leave it in the comments down below. This is Harry from When Harry Met Board Games saying thank you for watching, everybody. Take care, stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.